Uh, I just, I just want to check that I am audible and visible.
Yeah, yes to both.
All right. All right then. I would prefer if POIs were offered via chat. And yeah, good luck, everybody. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason we already asked for consent before recording is because I think everyone here already implicitly recognizes the right to digital anonymity. What do we stand for in opening government? Firstly, we think this debate is very simple. We think everyone deserves the ability to stay anonymous on the internet universally, regardless of who they are. We will take the heavy burden and say in 90% of cases, if not 100% of them, people deserve the right to stay anonymous on the internet. Secondly, we are more than happy with doing things like banning bots or banning accounts that generate the worst forms of hate speech before they get too large. That isn't our burden in the debate. It's whether or not we need to expose their identity, etc. We accept that it might be harder to do these activities, but we will take that burden and prove to you, even with that worst case, like you should be able to do things like access a universal right to anonymity on either side of our house. Before I move into our positive contributions in this debate, like just like a bit, like a small piece of framing that's going to outline the rest of my speech. I think there is two ways in which people consider something to be a universal right or a right regardless. It is something A, that is inviolable regardless of the positive or negative aspects of this right, i.e. there are certain rights where regardless of whether or not this right existing is a good or bad thing, you allow for it to exist. And secondly, there are some rights which you accept as a right because of the large utilitarian value that it may have, i.e. because the benefits of this right vastly outweigh the harms, you're going to accept that it is a right that people should have. We're going to prove to you that the universal right to privacy is something that satisfies both of these barriers or metrics for you to vote for it as a right. First argument then on why it is why outside of a utilitarian aspect, I forgot the word, like Kantianism or whatever, this is a right. You have the right to universal anonymity. The first thing I want to note here is that the right to universal anonymity is an extension of your right to privacy when operating within the digital sphere. Why is this the case? One, we think that in the digital sphere, any information that you output can easily be linked back to you. This is because the companies and the countries that are tracking you have large amounts of data and data points that they can use to track back to who you are as an individual, the way that you behave, where you went for lunch, where you spend your evenings, etc. We think even a small bit of information leaking can lead to you easily being doxxed in the many instances that we see today. So we think this is an extension of your right to privacy. In the same way that you're not asked to not mask your face in public, or you're not asked to open your doors and have glass walls at all times, we think that you have the ability to protect your identity when operating on the internet. Why then is the right to privacy important? The first thing I want to note here is the right to privacy is the foundation of agency. You need to be able to have a space to operate where you aren't publicly liable for every move you make, regardless of the positive or negative outcome. But secondly, we think that it is a precursor to things like your dignity, i.e. people deserve to be able to have a dignified life on either side of the house. We think that you feel violated at the point at which your right to privacy is violated. For the same reason that if a robber breaks into your house, sits on your couch, takes a nap for 15 minutes and leaves, you're still going to want to criminally charge them for violating your rights, even if they take nothing from your house. We think the same reason is why people shouldn't be able to violate your right to privacy by forcing you not to be anonymous on the internet. I think this agency is derived because of the reasons I told you before. The only times where we find exceptions to this right to privacy is when we do criminal charges. But even note then, you have to get things like a higher barrier of like a reason for you to be able to do things to violate this right. And we think something similar should happen to the universal right of privacy, which is the barrier for you to say no to this universal right needs to be much higher than something a company can do. You need to prove at multiple levels where you need to do things like get a warrant, etc. So a way you weigh this argument is regardless of whether or not the opposition proves to you that the right to privacy has good or bad impacts, we think that the right to internet anonymity is something people deserve regardless. If you believe in the right to privacy, the right to be able to not have glass walls, etc., you're voting for OG. Before I move into my second argument, closing.
Yes, so the right to privacy works when you're in private, but when you're in a public forum online, that is a public space. Why should the same like anonymity not be allowed
Right.
for
The first thing to note here is that the
physical
internet
person.
isn't just social media. This is also the right to privacy in like the browsers that you're using, like the websites that you're attending. If I look at a website, which is just like, how do I best have the like safe sex or whatever in like a society that is conservative about sex? And like, if I'm getting tracked because of that search, that is also a violation of my right to universal like anonymity, etc. The second thing to note here is even if this is about social media, we think people still should have the ability to operate in this and understand when they want to reveal their identity and when not to. If you are walking down the street, no one has the right to force you to tell you their name and where you tell them your name and where you live, right? We think that's something similar, and I already proved this in my argument. Okay, second argument then is on the utilitarian framework, why having a right to universal privacy has more benefits than harms. The first thing I want to note here is just that I'm going to take into account like probably the argument that's going to come out from Op on like hate speech and how like they prevent the rise of hate speech, whatever. I think the first thing to note here is that privacy is not the tipping point for whether or not people engage in hate speech. You have many people today in very public forums making really shitty statements, knowing full well that they're displaying their public identity. This is because they feel like they have a community that is going to support them, regardless of whether or not they are private or making these statements in public spheres. For a statement to gain trajectory, and if it is extremely harmful, we're more than happy for you to take down that statement, but we don't think that's a reason for you to do things like dox these individuals and let their identity be known to the public. The first thing I want to note then is that the silencing effect of a lack of right to anonymity more impacts individuals in vulnerable situations and communities than it impacts individuals who are willing to do things like hate speech, etc. Because individuals who are willing to espouse hate tend to be individuals who have a relative privilege in society and therefore are espousing shit that is like considered to be good in like olden days, etc. But people in vulnerable situations are more scared of the physical harm to their body at the point at which their identity is exposed. So for a gay teenager looking up different sites as to how to access the LGBTQ plus community in positive ways, if they live in a conservative state where their name can lead them to being physically harmed, we think that teenager deserves this right at every point of the way. But the second thing to note here is just that individuals who control power, who control your agency, have a greater ability to take that away if you don't have the right to privacy. This is because in companies always want things like the ad revenue. Politicians always want things like to maintain their power, to control the sphere of like speech, etc. If society decides what is okay and not okay, you shouldn't be forced to reveal your identity on the internet because of something somebody else says. So we think at the point at which the most vulnerable communities, the ones that want to come together to fight out against the government, if they are silenced, if the ones that live in situations where they face physical harm and need to be able to reach out to one another to feel safe, if they are silenced, we think you should believe in a right to universal anonymity. Vote OG, panel.
All right. I thank the Prime Minister for their fine remarks and would like to invite the Leader of Opposition to open the case for the opposition bench. You're here.
Hello, can you see me and hear me?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Great. Give me a second. All right. I don't have any preferred preferred POIs, so just give it how you'd like. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. We'll agree with opening government's metrics in this debate. In order for them to win, they have to prove that rights are inalienable and immutable. But what government concedes off the bat is that in some instances, this isn't true. They talk about criminals for whom it's okay to take rights away from, which in and of itself tells you that this is not an immutable thing that they want to stand for, which then meant that the burden they took in this debate was one where they wanted to themselves defend 100% anonymity as per the PM's own definitions. But the burden on ours wasn't to defend 100% transparency. We simply have to tell you that there are instances where the right to privacy, the right to digital anonymity wasn't something that should have been upheld, which then and therefore tells you that this isn't a right, but rather a privilege that we afford to people, right? Because if any of you have listened to Ashish Kumar's principles, super shiny principles, like video, you would know that right to free speech isn't really a right because we don't afford it to everyone. rights look like things such as the right to self-defense, which are true in all instances, things that we can't take away even from prisoners, even from criminals. So the bar that this team has to prove to you is that high a bar. What am I then going to do in this speech? The first thing I'm going to do is explain to you what our world looks like. Secondly, I'll deal with the utilitarian metric. That is to say that in some instances, it's okay to give a right as long as the utilitarian benefit outweighs the harm. In terms of what our world looks like, I think it's pretty simple. I think you can have like anonymity in some instances. For example, when you're doing transactions financially, when you're using government websites and giving like personal information about, say, things like your address, for example. But we think it's also just not important for you to have anonymity when you're engaging with social media. And I'm going to actually later on deal with the most vulnerable stakeholder in this debate, people who are looking for safe spaces, and also explain to you why those safe spaces become far more volatile and far more harmful in their world. The first thing to note here is their kind of preemptive attack on us to say that the anonymity isn't a tipping point for people being bad actors. But the unfortunate reality for them is that it is, because in the current world, in the physical space, the transparency acts as a mechanism of checks and balances. You regulate the things that you do. I regulate, for example, the choice of words I make in this speech, because I know there are a million people, or not a million people, there are 50 people on this call that are listening to me. It's true of all instances when you are in the physical space, because you know, for example, that the things that you say is going to be taken in by someone around you, and they're going to pass some judgment or have some idea about your character and judge your character based off of the way you act. This means you did regulate when you did have those eyes on you. You did regulate, for example, when you were walking down the street and you did see someone that annoyed you, for example, or that someone did bump into you. You weren't likely to shout and say the worst things that came to your mind because you were aware of the fact that there were other people around you. That was not the case when you had universal anonymity, because because when you could hide behind a veil of anonymity, you had no reason to regulate. You could say whatever you wanted and no one could hold you accountable for it. No one could pass judgment on your character. No one would even know that it was you who said it. And that was precisely what the tipping point was. Because even if this team says that bad actors and evil people were going to be bad in either way, it doesn't matter. There are more people that will enter into this on their side, which means the harm of hate speech, the harm of bad actors is just far, far amplified. But the second thing I'll prove in this regard is actually telling you why people will be bad actors and even people who aren't inherently evil. Because the reality is that all of us have negative emotions in us, and negative emotions are incredibly strong because they're built on anger. They're built on the need to exact revenge or harm on things that have been done to you, which you felt incredibly grieved by. So you had a more visceral emotion and a more long-lasting emotion when they were negative. And that meant that when you were confronted with things that did aggrieve you, you were likely to lash out and have those negative emotions come up as well. It's precisely the reason, for example, when you are angry, you tend to swear because you feel incredibly grieved, and that anger pushes you to express it in a way that is proportional to what you're feeling. But here's the thing. In their world, when you have an outlet behind which you are anonymous, when there is a veil that protects you from the worst things that you say, you're far more likely to use that outlet as a means of getting your emotions felt out, because you did want to shout, you did want to say things that were inside your mind, that were built up inside you over time. And now you precisely had an outlet in a digital space, a public space, but most crucially behind the veil of anonymity to be your worst self. So what that meant was that you did have people, even those that weren't just the worst actors, actively entering in and actively being bad. Before I explain why this is incredibly problematic and why this makes this digital space worse, does closing have a POI?
Yeah, so I think most of your case is predicated on the idea that universal means afforded to everyone. Why do we refer to it as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, even though prisoners can't vote, prisoners don't have freedom of movement, all of those sorts of things? Surely your narrow characterization defeats
that's bad etymology. You're using the wrong words to prove things that are right. And most importantly, we do think universal human rights are universal. No one supports you actively torturing prisoners. I mean, I don't know what I don't know what world you live in. But the world I live in is a world where where prisoners are treated with dignity, and actors that violate those human rights are actors who are incredibly condemned. Just look at what's happening in Israel and Palestine. Like, no one's simply saying that just because Hamas is a terrorist, you should do the worst things that you can. The reason you don't is because human rights are universal. So your burden is to defend this in all instances. You literally prove the thing that you asked me. The second thing to then talk about then is why the digital space gets far worse. Because the ultimate reality was that they said that there were safe spaces that people could look to behind the veil of anonymity. The problem, though, was that there was also that these spaces weren't inaccessible to bad actors. So, for example, if you went to a community online on Tumblr or Reddit, for example, that community was also accessible to the worst actors who wanted to impugn on your rights, who wanted to break down that safe space, which is precisely why even on subreddits, you have people of differing political views coming in and starting discourse. The reason this is incredibly problematic is because now, under the guise of anonymity, you create safe spaces. But because anonymity goes both ways, the bad actors have an in into these spaces and have the credibility and the license to be to be their worst actor as possible, which meant they were likely to impugn hate speech. They were likely to be incredibly mean and incredibly harassful of people that were in those safe spaces. What that meant is you subjected vulnerable people to a space that was volatile, a space that was harmful, because they went in thinking that this was going to be a safe space, only to be bombarded by a bunch of anonymous people who were just trying to derate them or attack them for who they were. That was something we never wanted to stand for in our side, because that was exactly the kind of things that made those safe spaces far, far volatile, but also lured vulnerable people into those spaces. In our world, it's hard to do that. In our world, you don't fall into that false sense of security. For those reasons, vote opposition.
All right, I thank the Leader of Opposition for their fine remarks and would like to invite the DPM to extend OG's case. You're here.
Oh, hi, sorry. Give me just like 30 seconds to set up my timer, if that's okay. And just to confirm, I'm audible and visible.
Yeah, yes to both.
Okay. Oh. I'll start my speech. Oh, preferably POS in the chat possible. I'll open the chat right now. Okay. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll talk about 3 things in my speech. First, let's talk about whether the occasional violation of a certain right makes it not a right. Second, let's talk about the harms of like anonymity and why that's not important in this debate. Lastly, just talking about why like this is a right because it also protects you and it actually feeds into the self-defense metrics that opening opposition wants to talk about. Firstly, opening opposition's main push is just like, oh, because you can take away a right from like a criminal. When you can take away something from a criminal, it means that this is no longer a universal right. They basically have this fixation on the word universal and ask us to prove why you can't even take this away from criminals. This is obviously an absurd push, an absurdly high burden for open government to take, because we believe in the right of freedom to movement and the right to like vote, for example. But these are obviously things that are taken away from criminals for obvious reasons that their ability to freedom to movement and their ability to write creates huge amount of third-party harm in society. But still, we still believe in the right to freedom of movement for the average individual, and we still believe the right to vote, right? I think that taking away some, like, obviously some rights are more immutable than others. Like, for example, we still don't support torturing even if you're a criminal, but I think rights that are slightly more immutable are still rights that generally needs to be afforded to everybody else, because I think that this is something that you need to absolutely defend on a human right basis. But secondly, I'm going to prove to you later why this actually feeds into the right of self-defense and that the right of anonymity is equally as fundamental. Secondly, they talked about the harms to like hate speech and like a bunch of other stuff and like the fact that you need to create a safe space. I want to note that we literally preempted that in Thej's speech. We told you that we're more than happy to support a right to block people as well. So if you're an individual, you go into space and this is like not the space you're looking for, we're happy to block people that creates a toxic environment because it creates third-party harm. We're also happy to tell them that they need to follow some sort of community guideline in terms of what you're like, the way you can phrase certain things, not the content you can say, and the fact that you can remain anonymous. But we also think that it's an individual right to block other people as well. We think people have the ability to do so. Don't let them get away with the idea and the way they describe these people as like they're super oppressed, but like most of the time people can just like literally block a person or exit from a space. I think that is also a right that exists in a digital space. You can always exit the space for as much as you can. We support the freedom of moving around as well. So we're happy for people to literally take away that. But even if you don't agree, right, that like you think the right to like anonymity creates significant harm, I think that this is not important to this debate because we can prove to you why in certain instances it is a absolute prerequisite to other rights. The first thing we tell you is that it is a prerequisite to privacy rights because oftentimes your inability to stay anonymous means that like other people can track like where you go on browsers, other people can track what you do online, other people can track what you say, and a bunch of other stuff. We agree. We think that privacy rights is something that's crucially important. This is why like in Tuition Pump we don't allow people to just come and search our homes. Equally, like I think the CO like preemption or the CO preemption here is like, oh, but like you're in a public space, so you consented to your privacy being eroded anyways. Like no, just because I'm walking in a public park doesn't mean someone can just come up to me and look through my bag. Like we equally protect privacy rights in a world where you're in a public space. I don't know why that's important. We think that your ability to protect yourself and your identity is the most fundamental right in society, and that's why we ought to protect it. But before we talk about why this is important in terms of this, how this protects you against state surveillance and the freedom of expression, which is equally basically as important as the right to self-defense, therefore fulfilling OO's metric, I'll take a point from closing opposition.
So maybe you've changed since PM because a lot of things have changed in your case, but you seem to be against the amalgamation of data that happens, for example, when you browse on incognito mode. Is that too far of a violation of privacy, and would you oppose that kind of data tracking?
Like, I mean, like a lot of the times you consent into those things, right? Like we're saying that this is a right to anonymity. So like you can choose, the choice is yours. You can choose to let your data being out. You can choose for your data to being protected. If you're talking about how there are certain mechanisms that needs to be like your data has to be tracked for like internet to even operate, you can choose to do that. We think that the problem in your world is that people can't choose. People don't have the choice as anonymity. People don't have the ability to use incognito mode to the fullest extent because even when incognito, like I don't know, it's still not fully protective. I think that we prefer a world where this is a universal right. Yeah, like also tech is not an issue. This debate isn't about feasibly whether it's like physically or technologically possible. It's just whether we support it as a right or not. Okay, why do we support it as a right, fulfilling O's metric on why this is a prerequisite to other rights? Presumably, everyone in this debate probably cares about protection against surveillance and the freedom of expression. I mean, we're all debaters, right? I think in a world where there's a widespread digital surveillance, anonymity is a crucial thing that protects you against invasive practices of governments, other people, and other abusive actors. This is a prerequisite to self-defense, and by extension, OO agrees to this and concedes that this is important because they literally told you self-defense is something you can't even take away from criminals. I think this is where the debate is going to have the largest delta because presumably when the internet, where there are no abusive actors that can actually track you using your name, those people were not going to be anonymous anyways. Whereas I think it's the people who live in authoritarian states or people who live in terribly like pervasive spaces with huge amount of surveillance and could potentially be abusive, where digital anonymity is really, really important. Obviously, anonymity allows you to protect free speech because in an authoritarian state, in cases where expressing certain views can lead to social ostracization or punishment, this is why you need things like anonymity. And why do we care about self-defense and why do we care about like, I don't know, tools and like our ability to have power against powerful actors and state? Well, because we also support things like protests. We also support things like anti-social criticism. We're not comfortable with the fact that powerful actors are able to track whatever we do. Note that this argumentation also works for even the most benevolent states, because look towards the United States. Like when, I don't know, the Israel-Palestine thing happened, in Harvard, they exposed people who supported Palestine and literally doxed those people. Note that in your world, the rich and the powerful literally get anonymity, whereas on our world, everyone gets that because we believe this to be a universal right. We believe this is the most important thing because this literally allows you to protect yourself against things like social ostracization and punishment. The intuition pump is, this is why we also don't lock people up when they say, like, when they lie about themselves, right? Like the only reason we ever do that is if it has actual consequences that create third-party harm. But if a person lies to protect themselves, we never think that that is something wrong, and we grant them this right. We think that is a fundamental protection mechanism, and if you believe in self-defense, and by OO like analysis, they believe in self-defense as well, you have to believe in the mechanism and anonymity, because this is how you're able to counteract the state's power to actively track you down. This is how you enable the powerful actors like corporations to not be able to track you down when you say something online. On our side of the house, people actually have a choice. If they don't want to be anonymous, they can do that. But we believe it's a universal right because it's prerequisites to a bunch of other rights that you ought to have. If you support right to privacy, if you support the right to self-defense, you probably should support the right to anonymity in digital space. All those reasons, proud to propose.
Great. I thank the DPM for their fine remarks and would like to invite the DLO to close the opening half. Here.
Alrighty, can everyone hear me?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Okay. Okay, I will please take POIs in the chat or visually. Panel, side OG wants to have their cake and eat it too, because they wanted to selectively defend rights they also wanted to prop were inalienable. Their case made no sense. Panel, I would just encourage you to please Google the word universal. Like, I'm sure the last words on the end of it are something like in every single case, right? And I think what that just necessarily meant was that this gov had to support the right to anonymity in every case. But I'm going to explain why why the stance they take on, engage with them in their best case, was particularly devastating for their claim. Essentially, they run this idea that if they can prove net utility to you, then we ought offer this as the right. The problem is, I think they fail at the first instance if you wanted to accept this as the premise, because I don't think that they prove to you that it is net util. I think after LO's speech, you can just believe that there were going to be an equal mix of harms and benefits, right? But that those harms will probably likely outweigh, right? Because there was more hate speech in the counterfactual where people felt that they had the ubiquitous and inalienable right to privacy online and anonymity online. I'm going to whip back to this, but I think it's particularly devastating because if they're unable to prove net utility, then they simply can't offer this as a right. Okay. Next, onto this idea of protecting data. They say two things. Firstly, that vulnerable people exploring themselves online, for instance, like queers in conservative communities, are going to have their data mined. And secondly, people are going to have their data farmed by corporations and authoritarian governments. The first thing to just say is that obviously this is a symmetrical issue, right? Because bad actors don't care about your rights under the status quo or in the counterfactual, right? The GOP in the United States is going to mine your data regardless of whether you have rights or not, and Google is going to continue that regardless of whether you have rights, right? They're just going to violate your rights in secret. And I think the most intuitive example to like intuition pump this, right, is just like the United States, despite the 8th Amendment, still persecuted Muslims in the wake of 9/11 and did things like waterboarding despite being explicitly against in their Bill of Rights cruel and unusual punishment, right? They did things which their Bill of Rights explicitly said are fucked up, right? Because it was done behind closed doors. It was deeply unclear why they would be able to do this better, right? Now, they say, but OG tells us, sure. And I think that really clearly pumps out to you why exactly bad actors are not going to stop as a result of installing this as a right. What that meant was that bad actors were that the installation of a right was never going to protect your data from bad actors. But then anyway, DPM just tells us, you can opt into this and you can choose to have your data mined, right? I'm glad you say this, right? Because as we agree, you ought be able to opt into this, right? In the same way that when you walk into a McDonald's in public, right? You consent to having your face filmed on CCTV cameras, right? You agree to an implicit contract when you were in a public space. The same thing existed online. Just because the forum was some chat room in an Instagram group chat or in the Instagram comment section, it didn't change, right? You still entered into an implicit contract to act in a particular way, to reveal certain things about yourself, right? There was no reason why we ought protect this right. There was no reason why you ought have these informations protected from protected from other people, right? But notably in the counterfactual, right, it was always going to be the case. Whereas we got people to opt in, right? So to the extent that you wanted to share this information, you absolutely could on our side, right? It meant that if you wanted to create a public Instagram profile and forego your right to privacy, you could do that on our side, right? Whereas on their side, you couldn't, right? I think what that meant was that they essentially don't have a contribution at OG. They run a symmetrical case to the status quo, which was one where you have a right that you can opt into in some cases, and they don't defend it in the way that they needed to defend it, because they needed to defend the right to anonymity in the way that someone would defend the right to self-defense, as we tell you at LO. We don't even get that basic explanation, but then we don't get the explanation as why to, even if this were net neutral, it offers this right inalienably. And I think that really clearly knocks OG out of this debate. Now let's position this in terms of privacy for hate speech, which I hope preempts the CG extension, which is just to say that obviously this is net disutile, right? Because the thing that we will say, PM explains that people are still willing to do it in person because they know that other people would agree with them, and essentially there would be that support basis, right? Two things to say, right? Obviously they tell you that it isn't a tipping point. Two reasons why this is a tipping point. Firstly, which we explained to you at SANS, the codification as a right makes people feel secure enough to do heinous things. The intuition pump here is just like, look at the First Amendment in the United States of America and how that inflames hate speech. We don't have the same issue in Australia, for instance, because we don't have inalienable protections on freedom of speech, right? And what that meant was that Australians conducted themselves with a regard for the fact that speech was not necessarily a right. It was a privilege, something that they entered into on the basis of a social contract. Now, OP has not proved to you why the utility of a particular right in this case necessarily needed for it to be inalienable. And I think what that meant was that the basis of entering it on a contract as on an implicit contract basis was far more likely to result in a better utility outcome, which wins this debate on their own metric. The second thing to just say here is obviously in online spaces, this was probably not going to be true, right? Because unlike when you were at your Antifa rally with your racist buddies and you felt okay, being racist and saying heinous things and hate speech, right? You didn't have that same protection in a Facebook comment section, right? Unless you actively went out and told your friends, hey, can you come be racist with me in the Facebook comments, right? And I think that just wasn't a realistic version. When you were just being mean and abusive in Facebook group chat, you are quite likely to get ratioed or just treated badly, right? And I think those things were going to be likely to be bad. You didn't feel the same level of support. Before I move on, I will take closing.
What if the bad actors that you describe aren't other people on the internet, but the company that created the social media, the company that created the platform, the company that created whatever else themselves?
Fuck off Instagram. I don't understand this POI. If you don't consent to it, get off Instagram, right? The problem is when the Chinese government persecutes people who are vulnerable based on data, right? This was going to happen symmetrically, right? But the other thing to just say is that Instagram and Facebook lost all of their power to moderate social spaces at the point at which the government said, oh, you have a duty to protect people's anonymity. It meant that even if they had the IP address, which they couldn't source in your counterfactual, right? They had to hide this from the authorities. It meant that when someone was being abusive, when someone was talking about committing crimes, or someone was just being mean to a minor and not necessarily even committing a crime, but just being abusive, they couldn't pass this information on to the authorities. What this meant was that safe spaces were never safe. We told you at the start of this debate that safe spaces need to be space, but then these could always be accessed, right? DPM tells you, these people can, you can just block people who are accessing your safe spaces. But obviously this is a flimsy response, right? Because the thing to say here is people can make other accounts, because the best Instagram can do is just make bot accounts obsolete by banning these bot accounts, but people can just create more accounts. And notably as well, the people are probably attacked on characteristics that are likely to be attacked on by a lot of people. People will just create more accounts and attack them on the same basis. So you were never likely to escape this kind of abuse online. Very proud to oppose this motion.
All right, I thank the DLO and all of the speakers in the opening half and would like to invite the MG to start the closing half. You're here.
Hello, just checking that I can be heard.
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool. I'm happy to take POIs however people prefer to offer them. Chat or voice is fine. I'll also call for POI at some point in the speech. Yeah, I will just take one moment to arrange my paper. Also, I do apologize for the mild decapitation caused by my laptop angle. Unfortunately, unfixable here. Look, this opening opposition is obviously out of the debate today because instead of actually trying to engage in this debate in a good faith way, they attempt to fiat the win by pushing such an absurd burden on the opening government team that no team in this debate would be able to meet and define a right that meets that standard. Judges, obviously the edge core at this tournament are intelligent and intended to set a balanced motion for the finals. That means it's probably not the case that you have to define that this has to be a unique right that is over everything else, and the standard that everyone else is operating in is clearly a good thing. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. First, we're going to be the first team to uniquely prove why the right has to be absolute, considering the context of incentives that would justify violating that right. I'm then going to explain how this would change the digital ecosystem and why that is important. And third, I'm going to explain why it's particularly important now when generative AI is such a significant change. First, why does this right have to be absolute? The context to this is some rights are absolute not just because we think the right is absolute in of itself, but because there are such strong incentives that would be used to argue against the right's existence or argue against preserving the right, that the only option is to have an equally strong absolute counterforce. Examples to this, for example, would be the right to political association or free association. There are obviously immense incentives for any government to try and oppress that, which means that you have a countervailing immense incentive to allow any sort of free association. Equally, a right to a fair trial. Immense incentives for a political government to score points by reducing that. Equally immense incentives to push in the other way. Why is then anonymity one of these rights? There are obviously 2 groups that might be interested in doing this. Non-state actors like companies or non-governmental organisations or governments. I'm going to address them separately. On companies, why is it the case that companies have an immense incentive? Why do they have this incentive? I'm going to note one thing here, though. Obviously, companies have immense coercive power in order to get you to agree to these trade-offs. Opening opposition is bizarrely glib at this point for someone engaging in an online debating tournament, and they say just, "Oh, get off Instagram." But in order to participate in this tournament, we've each probably signed like 8 to 10 different contracts that we did not read in full. That first explains that it is very difficult to exist online and do things like get a job or pay for power without A, accessing the internet, but B, that you do not have capacity to meaningfully engage in, negotiate, and read those contracts and understand your obligations. That means the principal obligation that is created by signing those contracts doesn't apply to you in a meaningful way, and therefore it is a coercive force behind these companies. Like non-state actors having the ability to define if you get a job is immense power, obviously that it's not a free and fair choice. The first reason that companies have immense capacity to violate this right is first, people don't really understand the extent of information that is harvested, right? Like even in the scope of post-Cambridge Analytica, the vast majority of people don't understand quite how widely that company was stealing people's data, which means that people don't have a capacity to protect themselves because they don't have the ability to understand why it's wrong. But second, there are obviously immense profit capacities to do this. The obvious example is breaching anonymity is how Google became one of the largest companies in the world, how Meta became one of the largest companies in the world. I'll take you in a moment opening and explain that there's an immense profit capacity that exists here. But third, certain types of product development inherently require this type of technology. That is to say, it's really, really hard to develop certain types of like digital technologies without accessing this. No, I'll explain why you can get it in a compatible way with this right in a moment, which means that certain corporations have a built-in reason they have to. Finally, obviously, anti-competitive behavior is really easy and really profitable as an internet giant, therefore you are likely to do it to benefit. I've explained why you can't meaningfully consent. I've explained why these companies have a reason to do that. Before I move on, opening.
People can still violate rights. Why is this a universal right that should be afforded to all people?
I'm literally in the process of explaining that. Maybe France actually engage in this debate. Moving on to why governments equally justify a universal right. Obviously, governments are equally coercive as companies, if not more. But people don't understand this. There are reasons that governments can justify this type of violating this right. Obviously, they can do things like target policy in terms of safety. People do not understand the scope or nature of the violations of this right that exist. No, look at what happened with NSA spy cameras and like Cambridge Analytica. Therefore, there is a really strong reason for this right to be violated, so it needs to be an equally strong countervailing force. That is the only way to deal with that, to deal with this push. What happens when this right is then absolute? There are two types of violations of rights. There's casual violations of rights, and then there are violations that are likely still going to occur. By casual violations, I mean the fact that we will sign 10 contracts selling our souls to use this to be at this tournament today. We tell you that in a lot of instances, these casual violations just stop when it becomes absolute. Why is that the case? Obviously, because now when this right is absolute, there's a really clear thing that you can use to build public attention against this. You can identify the fact that a universal right has been breached, and it becomes much more incentive to report on it, particularly in journalism, but also much more common to care about it and appear and be concerned. This is why things like banning political parties has immense backlash, even in otherwise regressive states, because it's a universal right that we don't see curtailed. That is why it is effective at the vast majority of this. What about violations that still do happen? Because some universal rights do get violated, although needed to engage in this debate. But we tell you that certain types of protections are way more likely against violations of universal rights. You see things like much more court oversight about when this is allowed, or in certain instances, for example, you do things like have super explicit warnings on websites before you start having to use them, or you just pay people for their data before you're able to do that. All of this explains to you that it means that the threshold for being able to violate this right becomes much, much higher, and people are much better informed as a result. These violations of rights become rare and better justified. That's very important. How then does the internet change? First, to get off what I'm sure will be Shah's extension, how does data collection still happen? Why can the internet still exist? First, you can just use surveys to collect data. People will opt in, particularly for payment. B, you can do things like generate synthetic data. That's really effective, and it means you can still do the types of modeling that is necessary in these instances. Or C, you can just do actually get people to opt in and meaningfully consent. What that means is it'll change the way it exists. Maybe it's slightly worse. Totally happy to cop that for a much better world. B, we tell you that governments are likely to do things like A, invest in much more significant regulatory processes to protect these rights, insofar as that's why people get really tetchy when things like Twitter is seen as politically misapplicating on political association and things like that, which means that you're much more likely to get the same types of protections that exist around anonymity and things like that, which is clearly very important. But we also just tell you the likely investment in the types of technology that promotes this. Notably, I'm just going to deal with efficacy really quickly. Leader of the opposition talks about the US torturing people, that it doesn't, torturing people as a result of that, an example of it's not effective. But obviously that's very distant. People care about rights when they impact people towards them. What I've just explained to you is that there's a massive push to violate people's right to anonymity. The only way to protect that right is therefore an equally significant push in the other direction. Proud to propose.
All right, I thank the member of government for their fine remarks and would like to invite the member of opposition. Here.
Awesome. Am I audible?
Yep, audible and visible.
It must be hard as a panel to actually adjudicate this debate, because teams start by explaining what their framework is for what is to be a right, but then in their analysis kind of latch onto things like utility, latch onto things like why a right should be absolute or inalienable, as CG says, despite saying that they don't need to prove that or take on that burden. It's very unclear. So I'm going to do at least the first part of my speech is going to be kind of piecing through everything that happened at opening, including closing government, and explaining what that actually means for this debate. And then I'm going to simply explain the logically prior analysis that all teams rely on, which is this a right or not, and explain why it's not a right. Noting, however, that a lot of the opening half, but also closing government's analysis, is that this is a right that should be protected, therefore that right should be absolute and universal. But that first crucial question of is this a right needs to be answered. That will also respond directly to opening government. So I think opening government has some rather flimsy, in my opinion, analogies to other rights to be able to form a base foundation for that right, and closing government completely doesn't do anything along those lines. Let's talk about what happens at opening. So we hear that from opening government take on a huge burden initially at PM to show that's an inalienable right. And obviously by their own discussion and opening up discussion, that is not fulfilled. DPM walks back on this again, response to that later on. What does opening opposition do? Opening opposition shows that the right can be taken away, like the right to free speech. What they do, I think, either by mistake or maliciously, is conflate universal with inalienable, right? And I think the POI from Closing Government takes it down, because you have universal human rights that are given to everyone, but they're not inalienable human rights and can be taken away. And that follows me on to the next kind of observation I want to make. Note that all of these observations are actually crucial contributions to this debate in actually dealing with what to actually make out from those teams. Utility is not a good metric to create that right, to decide whether the right is there or not, because as both sides have explained, you can infringe on rights in certain instances where it's utile to do so, and you can consent to giving up rights if you choose to do so. Again, why none of this is inalienable, look at the language used by all teams. So the government bench would say that there is a right, and you remove the right when there's a harm, and people can consent to give up the right. On op bench, we say there is no right, and some platforms provide anonymous services that you can go to, but you're opting into all of the other services, again, giving up this right if there is. And that doesn't really answer if there's a right or not. It just describes the current status quo in different ways using that language. So some extra work of principle work needs to be done here to actually answer the question in the debate. I'm going to extend here and explain why, even on a utilitarian framework, that right is actually useful, and this might also respond to Closing Government, because it's easier to justify infringing anonymity if it's not a right. And this goes counter to what we hear from Closing Government in terms of having that higher burden to be able to protect ourselves from companies and from the government. More direct responses to that later on, but let's flip it here, right? Because the actual outcome of the utilitarian analysis from the opening half, which is there's some people that benefit from anonymity and some people that are harmed by it, we think broadly not having a right means it's easier to infringe the right on the people who are doing harm. So the vulnerable individuals that don't do anything wrong are less likely, or probably not likely, to have that infringed upon them and take that anonymity away. But it's much harder when there is that right in place to take the rights away from bad actors. Now, the weighing here is that there are more good actors in terms of governments and companies than there are bad actors, such as people who do hate speech, who do terrorism, fund terrorism anonymously through it, and really all bad kinds of things that I don't need to mention in the internet. Those kinds of things can be handled better on our side of the house. Let's go on to whether this is a right or not. What does it mean to be a right? So I think the crucial metric here to start discussion about this is, I guess, the privacy right analysis that we hear from Opening Government, because they suggest that, you have the right to privacy, therefore you should have the right to anonymity on the internet. The first thing to note is you only have the right to privacy in private space. So your bag when you're walking through the park, or you in your home not having glass walls. The first question to ask, which is a fundamental question the government has to answer, is there ever a private space online? Like, it doesn't exist naturally, like the park that exists, like my house that I own, for example. Instead, the digital sphere is built up by complex infrastructure, both funded by governments in terms of telecommunication, but often done by companies. So your access to the things that Harry says is the most important things nowadays to getting a job, for all those kinds of benefits you get from Instagram, is you opting into a private service that's providing you that connection. All the data that's connected once you opt into that service is unfortunately part of that deal you're making with something that doesn't exist naturally. So that right by itself doesn't exist naturally, because at the moment you go onto a server at all, given my POI, you immediately log in your IP address. You immediately log in lots of things that are necessary for that information to travel through the internet in any sort of way. And that at that point, you are no longer in your private sphere. You are in a company sphere or a government sphere, which means you have no right in terms of the privacy of that. But obviously, in the instance of tracking and how far you're willing to go, the POI answer from Opening Government doesn't make sense, because otherwise you just always consent to give up your right immediately as you log into the IP. Even Closing Government's analysis that, when you have this right, you must be much harder for people to sign that right away. No, you sign that right away when you log into Facebook, right? You're still not reading it. That's not going to help you legally read the T's and C's. You might know you're signing your right away, but you're still going to do it because of all the coercive power that doesn't change on the rest of the house. At that point, it doesn't actually make sense for you to call it a right if by the very nature of accessing that service in the first place, by the principal definition and practical concerns are brought to you, you are always going to be giving up the right to anonymity in that instance. So there is no right in those instances, or you can call it a right, but it's meaningless at all. Let's talk about self-defense very quickly. Before that, actually, OG.
you're always walking into a house that has a shelter on it. You're always conceding your right to privacy because the house is something built artificially. You're obviously going to have to go into online space because this is a necessity in your life.
Bro,
it's a worse choice to force you to not have anonymity.
No, when I walk into my own house, I own the house, right? When I log into Facebook or when I use the wires and the service that has to be specifically set up so that I can connect to someone on the other side of the world, that's a lot of technology, that's a lot of work that I don't own. I'm using a service. For the same reason as I have a right to like water, for example. But if I want to go buy a bottle of water from someone, I can't say, that's my right, give it to me. I have to pay them because they're providing me that service. Very similar here. There is no fundamental foundation for that right. Self-defense is a very specific right. It has to be imminent harm to your person. It's unclear that the future harm from government surveillance is ever going to cater to this. Similarly, that also responds to the rather derivative point from closing government about protecting yourself against those kinds of governments. But even if that's the case, as opening opposition shares, that right's taken away when we have bad governments, it doesn't really matter in a practical sense. Note that the crucial burden only identified at closing opposition is that for any of these discussions about whether the right should be taken away, the utility of taking away the right, in which considerations, all presumes that there is this right here that no one else in this debate has ever done any analysis on. Clear contribution of the debate win to closing opposition.
Right, I thank the member of opposition for their final remarks and would like to invite the Gov Whip to close their bench's case. Here. Sorry, you're muted. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just realized. Our extension in this debate was threefold. Firstly, you cannot meaningfully consent to being on the internet because of how coercive a force is. And what that extension does specifically is take out of the debate any response that comes from Opbench about you consenting to be into that. And that both takes out OO, who says you consent to be online, you can choose not to be on Instagram, etc., but it also takes out CO, who says, well, you consent to go into public, you consent to do those sorts of things. You cannot meaningfully consent when you are coerced to go online in the way that Harry explains to you. The second thing we do, though, is we explain that the right to digital anonymity must be considered a right, regardless of if it meets some arbitrary framework that Shah chooses to set up at CO. The reason it must be a right is because it needs to act as a bulwark against the worst excesses of crime. And I'd like to note that we don't hold every single right in the world to some arbitrary metric of some arbitrary framework to see if it meets a right or not. I think OG is correct in setting up that we have rights for a variety of reasons. Some because they are intrinsic to an individual, like freedom of thought, for example. Some because they have huge utility. What we are saying in this debate, and what is unique at closing government, is that you must consider this to be a right to give it a high level of protection. And the reason it requires that high level of protection is because there is such a great margin of harm here that exists. It needs to be a bulwark to the worst excesses of companies, the worst excesses of harm. The final thing that we do, and what takes us over our opening in particular, is we prove the efficacy of this right. Opening says it should be a right, regardless of whether you can actually enact it or not. OO says, well, you can just bypass it or things like that. What Harry does in his speech is explain why this right grants so much more efficacy than in the comparative, which means that it protects far, far greater amounts of people. What were the responses we got to our extension? The only response we actually got was Shah saying that there were more good actors than bad actors on the internet. So even without this right, those good actors will be protected, i.e. you don't necessarily need that bulwark. But again, this completely misses the crux of our extension and what we POI OO, because this isn't about the actors that are on the internet using the internet and what they do to each other. This is about the creators of the platforms, those who have the greatest capacity to enact harm on individuals, and those who have the greatest incentive. Because the creators of not just the internet, but like the platforms that exist, social media, all of those sorts of things, explicitly have non-benevolent incentives, as Harry explains. They are profit motivated. They are motives of keeping you on the internet, of coercing you to stay on that platform, of coercing you to stay on longer and longer and longer. And it is for that very malevolent reason that we require this right to protect people. We prove the efficacy that explains that it does that. Why does this weigh over every team in the debate? Firstly, it just takes down the whole op bench. We prove that people can't consent. We prove that this is coercive. We prove that the right will be effective in protecting people. But secondly, we prevent the greatest potential margin of harm. Mega corporations have infinitely more power than any individual who might perpetrate hate speech. And that is why we are so clearly ahead in this debate. I'm going to respond to CEO, but I'll take that POI from them for engagement reasons. No, okay, OO.
Okay, Google stole and sold your data when it was illegal to do so. Even if the right was alienable, the harm still exists on your side. Why would Google not do it in the counterfactual when it becomes a right?
Things are laws and then things are rights. Harry explains that a right is far more significant than a law, warrants far more government action, far more public outcry, all of which would lead far more backlash to Google. But additionally, there would be far more preventative mechanisms in place if you believed it was a right. Because we believe there is a right to a free trial, we have Miranda rights, we have other preventative mechanisms that ensure that you have the right to a free and fair trial. In the instance where this was considered a right, as it should be, there are far more preventative mechanisms which prevent those violations in the first place. Things like greater encryption being like governments like mandating greater encryption, or companies having far more regulation on them. All of those things would happen in our comparative world. All right, CEO says, is this a right to begin with? The first thing I'd like to point out is all of our material is just surprisingly non-contingent on any of this, regardless of whether it meets Shah's weird framework of what a right is. You should treat it as such because it is a bulwark to the high amount of potential harm. Does not require needing to meet that framework because of the benefits that you can get out of it. But additionally, I will respond to their reasoning, because they say firstly that the internet is not a private space, that it is a public space, and therefore you have no right to privacy within that public space. The first observation I'd like to make is you actually do still have a right to privacy in public, because you do not have to share information with people. You don't have to tell them your name. You can choose to wear clothes which mask your identity or things like that, and you have a complete right to do that in a public space. The only instance where you do not have a right to do this necessarily is, you know, when you enter a specifically more private space. For example, you might take your sunglasses off, you might take your hoodie off when you go into a store, but you have far more means to consent to that than you ever do on the internet, which is why this is a completely different situation. The second thing, though, is our extension explains to you why you were heavily coerced to engage in the internet against your will, because work happens on there, because they have a natural monopoly, and there's absolutely no competition, absolutely no comparative for you to get the things that you must get out of the internet. And additionally, because all of your friends engage on it, all of those sorts of things, you simply cannot avoid the internet. We have always recognized a right not to be in the public eye as well. There's things like the tort of invasion, things like the tort of invasion of privacy and those sorts of things in the legal system recognize the fact that you have a right to not be in the public eye. The internet is just as such. And final thing I'd note about that extension is that the self-defense material doesn't actually respond to us at all, only responds to OG, so I'm not going to bother responding to it. Now let's look at how we weigh against OO. I think our POI quite clearly explains that why even in their best case, where we can't stop hate speech, we still win, because just on the margin of harm, we have a far greater margin of harm. We far outweigh them because of the pernicious things Harry outlines companies can do to these people. But additionally, they don't prove that without this right, that those hate speech people, that those criminals will be appropriately dealt with. They don't prove that anyone will do a good job in dealing with them. So they don't actually reduce the margin of harm on their side of the house either. They then say that groups are going to violate this right. I think firstly, this is just not comparative, right? Even if we stop a large margin of harm, but not all harms, that right is still very utile. It's still doing a lot of good things. On their side of the house, they have absolutely no backlash to that. Our extension explains why there is efficacy, which defeats this claim. Finally, they say you have consented to it. Again, our extension knocks that out of the park. Clearly, this is a debate that goes to CG.
Right, I thank the Gov Whip for their prime remarks and would like to invite the Op Whip to close the debate. You're here.
Cool, can you hear me?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Thank you very much. We provide the obviously largest substantive harm in this debate, which is that we take this debate at its most principled framework and explain that this is simply not a right that people deserve, unlocking all of the pushes that opening opposition makes and dealing with the fundamental core of government's case. This debate is a closing opposition win, and at the end of the speech, you will be 100% sure of that and cast that on your ballot. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, on the extension, dealing with the responses and why it's the most important claim from opposition bench. Secondly, responding to closing government and taking down their extension. Lastly, dealing with opening government. Firstly, let's talk about the extension. We give you the extension as signposted in introduction that basically utility is not the correct metric to decide a right on, and instead this is more about about how about when you have the right to this, when you should be able to access this. All this analysis is done quite well at SHA. I don't think we get any pushback on how we decide this right is to be a right. The only thing we hear from Harper in that closing government whip speech is to say that this is a weird metric that SHA has come up with no analysis as to why this is weird, no analysis as to why this metric is particularly unpersuasive, and no responses to all the reasons that SHA gives you about why this is a more justifiable way to create a right than deciding on utility, which is obviously a bad metric because that allows people to give up that right. And if people always choose to give up that right, that is simply not a right that they have in the first place. To be more charitable to closing government, then, I think the next contest that they have against this right framework idea is to say that there is a foundation on there is a foundation of a right that if there are terrible consequences to you, then you should not have that. But I would say, and that is based on CG's extension here, that they can't meaningfully consent because the internet is so necessary. But I would say there are a set of circumstances in society where, we allow people the right to privacy that you must give up when you enter a public space. For example, a bank is particularly necessary for you to participate in society. It allows you to store your money. It allows you to do wealth accumulation. Yet you have to take sunglasses off when you enter the bank. You cannot wear a hat when you enter the bank. You must give them an identification card so they know your name, they know your address, they know your social security number, and they know everything about you, because that service is so necessary that even if it's coercive, that right to privacy does not exist. Similarly, a right to anonymity does not exist in that digital space. I don't think that being necessary is enough of a reason to overcome the stuff that Shah explains to you about why this is specifically not a right when you access a service that someone else is providing to you and expect to do it with absolutely, with absolute anonymity. Why is this more important than the contributions from opening opposition? Opening opposition's largest contribution basically is why this is disutile, about the rise of hate speech and other examples they point to here. 2 weighing metrics as to why our contribution is more important. Firstly, I would say that we engage with the real government burden. We don't say that these rights have to be inalienable. We don't say that you have to, never have to violate them, and therefore if you violate them once, that is not a right. We instead engage with the fact that, sure, sometimes you could be able to trade this right off, but we think that this is a right that you do not have the ability to access. You do not deserve that anonymity when you access services that other people provide. But secondly, we provide logically prior analysis to literally every team in this round by explaining why this is not a right you ever deserve to access. Before I move on to responding to the government bench, I will take one from closing government for engagement.
I noticed you haven't actually reminded us what this framework was, as Shah was quite very vague about what the framework is. If something is calling something a right prevents huge amounts of harm, what is the harm to just giving it the name of a right?
So the framework here is to say that it's not able to, you're not able to justify infringing something. Like if you infringe on that right over and over again, that is not a right you are able to justify, because you're not likely to infringe on the vulnerable, because it's hard a way to take away from the privilege. All of that material is given at Shah, no response from you. Let's talk about closing government and knock them out of the round. First thing to say is, if you believe the extension, then our analysis is obviously logically prior, because if there is no right, you do not need to consent to the stuff. They have a big burden here on closing government, though, because they have to prove that the harm you get from these companies accessing your stuff, they have to prove that the change is that these companies stop violating your anonymity, stop stealing your data so much that the utility benefit is worth it to grant people those rights, given the framework that they've set up themselves. Why are companies unlikely to change? Firstly, we say that companies already would principally do this, principally feel like they meet this under the status quo. People sign away their right to privacy in the status quo by abiding to terms and conditions. I think that's similar similar for them to be able to sign away their right to digital anonymity. But secondly, I don't think that closing government gives you any way to change the coercive power because the service is still as important, because people so desperately need to access it. So I don't think public attention is a sufficient enough mechanism for closing government to say that all companies are going to stop being coercive. They know you still need to access that bank online, so they make you give your identification data. They know that you need to be able to access Zoom to do your job, so they still make you sign those terms and conditions. You can never meaningfully consent on side closing government, so that right is never actually a protection. And the last thing they say here is it's desperately necessary, but all the bank stuff I already talked about here is a response enough. And the last thing to say here is that is that they never do any weighing here about the type of people they protect versus the type of people that they harm. Because when you allow people the right to digital anonymity, you protect terrorists, you protect people who create child pornography. And I don't think it's clear from closing government why they would want, like why trading off some people being able to access Instagram, not a particularly necessary service, is more important than than stopping people from trying to find child pornographers. Lastly, then, let's talk about opening government. Their first push here is to say that this is the same or like a prerequisite to the right to privacy. But I would say privacy and anonymity are particularly different, which we explain in POI to PM, which is that in that public space, you give up privacy. Sure, you don't have to tell Joe Blogs on the street your name, but they do have access to your face. They have access to the clothes you wear. They have access to the place you go because they're in the same place as you. I think that you have to, that sometimes in an online space, you have to consent to a higher privacy give up, and that's why it's not the same as anonymity, because anonymity is literally revealing nothing about yourself, which is not a right you are granted in a normal public space. The second thing that opening government says to justify this is they say, oh, you don't lock people up for lying. I think that's called identity fraud, and I think you do lock people up to lying. Self-defense only extends to how you are harmed physically, not how you are harmed on a digital space, not how you are harmed emotionally or mentally, which is why it wouldn't extend to that digital space. The last thing opening government says here is that they're able to stop some state surveillance stuff. But I think this is irrelevant because states always justify overriding rights, either because they're bad states and they violate your rights all the time, or the benevolent states like the United States that they talk about override them due to safety concerns. So they're never able to get any practical changes on stopping state surveillance there. The CIA is still wiretapping people on the daily, side with side, closing opposition.
Great. I thank OpWhip and all of the speakers for what was a great and engaging round. Once again, congratulations for getting to the finals. And if all of the judges can please join me on the Discord, room 1, Hatch Deliberations channel, that'll be great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the debate, everybody.
Thanks for the debate.
Thanks for the debate, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.